Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Godels and Pat Cummings. Public education has been under recent attack. The founders of the nation saw education as the key to a democratic society. But now, education has moved from that ideal with efforts to push responsibility away from government to vouchers and private charter schools. But don't blame Betsy DeVos. She is only just part of a larger movement that for decades has been amassing funds and honing their message and crafting policies. How did we get here? Can this trend be reversed? There is a wolf at the Schoolhouse Door. Let's discuss. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our podcast, Greg and Dr. Berkshire. Glad to have you. I'm excited about our conversation today.
Thanks for having me.
And in most of the podcasts that Greg and I have done, it has been in his wheelhouse because he's kind of an expert on unions and organizations, and this is a chance for us to do a podcast in my wheelhouse, which is in the field of education. And I finished your new book, which we can chat about.
And am I mistaken in seeing that you have two copies there?
Well, you are.
This is pretty exciting for me.
I'll tell you why I have two copies. There's a story behind that. Anytime there's a new superintendent.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So you owe us.
I've got mine here too, so we're up to four.
I put it on your bill though, Jennifer.
You owe us a cup of coffee next time you see him. Well, I have a tradition of giving superintendents books when they become superintendents. The one that was before in Tacoma, I gave her the Reign of
Error.
Reign of Error. And we have a new superintendent that was just announced. He's very progressive. He's a very smart fellow, and I have a lot of confidence he's going to do a good job. And I wanted to give him a copy of the book with a little note saying, "Listen to the podcast too." So
that's so great. I really appreciate it.
That's my tradition of giving books to superintendents. So let me just give a little background to everybody about who we're talking with. Jennifer, you are a very good podcaster that I've been listening to your podcast with Jack Schneider for years and shared so many copies of it to different people in my field. And you are a journalist, and you write for a variety of, what do you write for? The Nation?
I'm a freelancer, so anyone who will take me. But I tend to because of my interest in the intersection of education and politics, I tend to be more interested in left publications.
Okay. And you write well because you have a PhD in literature.
I'm not sure that those two necessarily go hand in hand, but I do have a PhD in English.
Okay. So anyway, and I am so excited about your book with Jack Schneider. I've read Jack Schneider's book on the measurement, and that's something that's a must for anybody that's in the field of educational research. And this book is just so important because it is coming at a time when we're seeing political change, and it's called The Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door. And maybe explain a little bit about how you arrived at this topic and give it a little overview of the book.
Well, Jack and I have been working together now for a number of years, and we really come at our work from different perspectives. He's an education historian. And so what I love about working with him is that whenever a new, quote unquote, new trend pops up, I can always ask him and say, have we been through this before? And the answer in terms of education history is almost always yes. And it's really jarring to go back and see how we just relive history again and again. And so we combined that interest. I think both of us were very interested in what was going on when Betsy DeVos became the Secretary of Education, and what seemed like a very extreme point of view was suddenly the, kind of like, she had the power of the bully pulpit. She was not new to me because I come from the Midwest. I'm from Illinois, and she's from Michigan, and I have spent a lot of time traveling through Wisconsin and Michigan and got very interested in how, after the 2010 wave elections, where Republicans really swept into office, it was really, some of the first signs of the Trump rebellion
Mm-hmm.
that we saw. I was fascinated by how much of that backlash focused on education policy.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, so often the coverage of the policy, whether it was Act 10 in Wisconsin that really tried to wipe out public sector unions there, or deep cuts to school spending, all kinds of expansions to school choice, too often these were written about or chronicled in ways that were really separate from the politics of what was happening. And so my goal is always to connect them. So Jack and I kind of merged all these interests together, and at a certain point he said, we should write a book about what's happening. And I think his hope was really to influence the election, whereas I had a much bigger hope, which would be that people would sort of wake up and see that, not only have we seen these same education policies rolled out again and again, but that they're really deeply political. And so I wanted teachers to see that, but also people who are living through these changes and maybe don't think that education policy is something they should pay attention to. So wake up, pay attention to it.
Right. There's a wolf at the door, but the wolf isn't Betsy DeVos. I think you did a good job in that book of saying it's the, well, you started, I think, talking about Dark Money, Jane Mayer, and Democracy in Chains, and how there are this group of people that have been systematically, progressively marching along dismantling our institutions. And the big one is education. And that's it just amazes me how effective they are and how no one is talking about them. And that's why your book is, I think, so important.
So one of the things that's really kind of driven me crazy over the last few years is that there have been all these fantastic books, like Jane Mayer's book Dark Money, and Nancy MacLean's book Democracy in Chains. And so I think people are very aware now that conservative plutocrats play an outsized role in this country in shaping our politics, right? That their influence in the electoral system determines who gets elected and how we talk about politics, what kinds of policies are acceptable. But the issue of public education almost never comes up. And when you think about the fact that public education is the sort of top dollar item in every state, of course that's what their focus is going to be on. And so if you travel through the heartland, for example, you'll quickly learn that all of these states has its own billionaire. And so in Wisconsin, there's a handful of billionaires who for generations now have set their sights on trying to get rid of public education. They loathe it because it's our most socialist institution. It takes money from the rich. It redistributes to poorer people, and they hate that. And so, of course, they're going to be focused on it. And so one of our big goals was to really get people thinking about why public education is such a juicy target, and to put it in, start to think about it, that when they're critical of the Koch brothers, for example, recognize that the Kochs, who are now down to one brother, that their top agenda item all this time, it's not just lifting regulation on, the amount of stuff they can belch out into the air, right, through their chemical companies and all of their various extractive industries. It's education, and they are so busy right now, thanks to the opening that the pandemic has given them.
How much of this started with Brown and race?
So I think that's where Nancy McLean's book is so valuable, and I really encourage people to read it if they haven't. There's this amazing scene in the book where James Buchanan, who is really kind of the libertarian economist who kind of their original thought leader who would go on to win a Nobel Prize, he realizes early on that that while they're very excited that Virginia has basically shut down its public schools in order to avoid having to comply with the integration order that's handed down by the Supreme Court, they realize that using race to justify that isn't going to do it. That it's turning too many people off around the country, right? They need a different way to talk about it. And so you see them very kind of, like almost overnight pivot to the language of the market. They start to use all of the same language that we're so familiar with today, that schools need autonomy, that parents need the ability to choose the right school that fits their child, that parents will be the best regulator. And it's really kind of shocking to see that this moment that now appears to us so abhorrent, that this is really where this language of the marketplace emerges, and that now we're so used to. So yes, I absolutely recommend that people go back and revisit that history. There's some great writers. Steve Suits has a book on After Brown, and John Hale, who's a historian who's now at the University of Illinois, who'd be a great guest for your podcast, has a book that's going to be coming out later this spring about school choice, and it's really complicated. I'll use that word, complicated legacy with regard to skirting that original Brown decision.
So it was race, but they shifted it to be libertarian features, of which the Koch brothers, this is in their bailiwick, but it's still race, isn't it?
Well, it's all of those things. It's the the fact that you have the libertarians seeing early on, like, here's the thing we've been waiting for, right? We're excited about Virginia closing its school down because our goal is to dramatically slash the tax burden on the wealthiest among us, right? And so if racial outrage enables us to get there, that's great. And so you see that legacy playing out again and again. And so, for example, when I would travel through Michigan, the DeVosses overlap with the Kochs in that they share a goal of reducing the tax burden on the wealthy, right? They're more in the religious wing of this oddball coalition that has really been with us since the 70s, that you see fairly early on. You see the libertarians and the kind of fundamentalist Christians aligning behind this goal of dismantling public education, but they're happy to work together. And so what I would see again and again when I traveled through Michigan was how effectively the right kind of poked and prodded and stirred those flames. I'm using many different metaphors here, stirred racial resentment in order to move, ever closer towards that goal of dismantling public education, right? We don't want to keep, you shouldn't let them just waste your tax dollars on those Detroit kids. But then really what would happen was that the policy would come back to harm the rural voters, right? Because frankly, the DeVosses see all the tax money spent on public education as a waste, unless it's being funneled into some kind of private edupreneurial, as we call it, enterprise.
Yeah. Well, is this just a basic structural problem of taxes and how schools are funded? I remember Jonathan Kozol's book, Savage Inequities. That was one of the first book that radicalized me a little bit.
Yeah. My dad's in that book.
No. Oh, really?
Uh-huh. Yeah, when so I grew up in Illinois, and my father was always kind of like the liberal do-gooder who worked in a moderate Republican administration. And one of the things that he was responsible for was East St. Louis redevelopment. And East St. Louis is actually in Illinois, which a lot of
Right,
people don't
right.
know. And so at a certain point, he had to take Jonathan Kozol to East St. Louis so they could talk about savage inequalities there.
I'll be doggone.
So if you look in that index, if it's on your bookshelf,
I'm looking at it. What's his
look
name?
Berkshire.
I don't see it.
I think it's in there, Tom Berkshire.
Tom Berkshire, that's amazing. Well, yeah. In fact, didn't he write about the suburbs in Chicago? And that it was
Oh,
Chicago.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So let me change the subject a little bit, but I'm interested in this. You said you discovered your passion for storytelling while covering a series of bitter labor battles that racked her native Midwest in the 90s. Tell me
Yeah,
about
now
that.
Greg's looking interesting. He's like, enough with this education talk.
Yeah, yeah.
So yes, so in the '90s, I was writing my dissertation, but I could not wait to be done with grad school. I knew that I wasn't interested in teaching undergrads, and the idea that you just keep studying the same thing and writing about the same thing over and over again forever, like that seemed very uninteresting to me. And it just happened that very close to where I lived, there was a major labor. It was a lockout, not a strike. But I don't know if you guys remember the Staley Lockout in the 90s.
Right.
So this was in Decatur, Illinois. And what happened was that Staley was a soybean processing company, and it turned soybeans and their various parts into sugar, refined sugar. And so it was purchased by a global conglomerate called Tate and Lyle. And they went to war with that union, and they implemented what are known as rotating shifts. So if you were a worker there, you went from having a regular schedule to working 12 hours during the day and then suddenly 12 hours at night. And so the workers they really felt like their way of life was under attack. And so I started going, and I had a radio show on the community radio station in Champaign, Illinois. And I would go and-
WILL.
No, WEFT.
Oh, I grew up in Rantoul and went to college in Eastern.
I went to Eastern.
Oh,
I went to the
God.
University of Illinois. You guys went to the lesser state
We
school.
did. We
And
did go to a
You
lesser.
probably didn't qualify for the big school.
Yeah,
Well,
and-
you know what? Eastern was the cheapest school in the state. So I
Yeah.
went to Eastern, and my sister went to Southern.
I paid
Those were our choices.
$33 a quarter to go to Eastern. So, yeah, Greg's background, his superpower is he's a philosophy. He went to philosophy and started his doctorate. Went to Pittsburgh, and
I got in Pittsburgh.
I guess we
I
could
grew up
all.
in Illinois. My uncle was a coal miner. He raised me around Danville. That corridor was a coal mining area until 1947. So he was a coal miner, and my whole family was. And there's a General Motors foundry in Tilton, which is in the Danville area, which is a big deal. And yeah, I know that area. I wanted to ask you a question, just to run back. I'm not giving up on education at all. Back to Kozol. Kozol was kind of a hero of mine when I was somewhat active in educational issues, mainly around my kids. I found that to be a very, very important book. And he wrote for New York Review of Books and all these other things. And he was like the person. And what I drew from that period, I find it odd today, is that that was essentially a aggressive period where people wanted to improve the public school system. People had ideas about racial balance, about integration, about funding. I mean, Kozol's whole thesis is that, look, there's insufficient funding for poor schools and there's over-sufficient funding for rich schools, and we have to equalize that. And what I find interesting is I read your book. It's a wonderful book. I recommend it to everybody. However, it appears that today's struggle, because you outline the struggle today very, very well, is a defensive one. It's trying to hang on to the public school system. And I'll just ask you a question, because I think part of what I see as a problem today in these discussions is public education appears not very attractive to people. Blacks have been crapped on in the public school system. Ever since Millikin versus Bradley, they refused to really integrate the school systems.
Right.
So blacks have had schools in ghettos, and they remain in ghettos. And working class kids, same way. You have this enormous disparity in the educational system. The taxes are paid by working people. They're property taxes in general. I don't know everywhere. You'd know better than me, but I know here it's property taxes. And the rich they get their property taxes redone, and the rest of us pay for the school system, the education system. So, I mean, my question would be, have we gotten away from trying to fix the educational system to make it more attractive to people, because we're losing constituency for it? When I was at 86, 87, they created in the public school system here a magnet program, which made the system elite. If you could stay all night in front of the schoolhouse, which we did because my wife and I were able to do this, but working mothers weren't able to do this, you would get your kids into the better schools. And virtually all the black and poor kids were put into a warehouse called Reisenstein School. And everybody accepted that. So why would you think that anybody would defend a public school system that in the last 30, 40 years has retreated from any kind of equality, retreated from any kind of Oceanville, Brown Oceanville, whatever it was, that 68, that's the same thing with the Shanker and the teachers. They were grasping for something that could create equal education that would be good for their children. They want an engagement with that.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, and I think it's really important that you referenced, Millikin versus Bradley. Like, when you go back and you look at the court's right turn in the 70s, I think we're used to thinking that began in the 70s. We have a long list of cases that, we can identify on everything from workers' rights to campaign finance that, very clearly leap out to us as like, oh, here's the real rightward shift that we see beginning in the Nixon era. But there were two Supreme Court cases that were absolutely fundamental as far as really putting the brakes on any kind of systemic progress. And one is the one that you mentioned, Millikin versus Bradley, that foreclosed upon the possibility of wider integration. So I grew up in Springfield, Illinois, and I was in the first group of we were under court-ordered desegregation, and so when I went into the 5th grade, we were bused across town to the east side of town, and our fellow students made the opposite trip. And it wasn't until I moved to Boston as an adult that I realized that there was any kind of political fury over integration and busing. So when I went back and I looked at that, I was absolutely stunned by, when I read the archives of the paper, how much bigger their sense of possibility was back then versus what we have today, right? That like I'm getting ready to work on a podcast episode about integration, and I can't tell you how difficult it is to advance any kind of progressive policy because parents are absolutely convinced that there are only a certain number of slots for, like, if you give up your opportunity slot to somebody else, right, then that means that young Greg isn't going to make it to Stanford. He's not going to make it to, wherever it is, this, the elite spot that you're convinced that your whole future depends upon. And so when I go back and when I read like what the debate was in Springfield in the 70s, and really a lot of it was driven by the idea that people felt very strongly that kids should have friendships of different races. And I thought, no one talks about anything like that anymore. So I think that part of what you're putting your finger on really is this sense of possibility that has been so limited. But there's another piece to it, and that is that our definition of what schools do has really changed for the worse. And so as the Democrats, accelerating in the 90s under Clinton, right, as they get more and more wary of embracing any kind of policy that would require anybody to give anything up, right, we're not going to force you to put your kids on a bus. We saw the backlash that generated. As the more they retreat from that, the more they settle on education as the thing that's going to fix everything. And so this has a couple of consequences, both of which are really bad. One is that it makes anyone without education or whose education doesn't translate into workplace like salary gains feel like a loser. It puts us on the corrosive path that we've ended up on today. But the other thing is that it just opens up the schools for enormous disappointment, right? They cannot possibly meet all of the demands that we heap upon them. And the more that education became the solution, the more it meant that we weren't going to do any of these other things, like raise taxes, like deal with, with other kinds of poverty, or even the sorts of zoning changes, right, that would make cities less oppressive places to live. So I would say that I'm actually more hopeful right now than I have been for a long time, because I hear the Democrats starting to talk differently. They're not putting all their eggs in the education basket, right? Like, who would think that, like Biden comes in and they start talking about, well, you know what? We're going to try to minimize child poverty by helping their parents be less poor. Right? That's a really novel idea. We have not heard anyone talk about that in decades. Instead, the idea was that you were going to lift kids out of poverty by holding their teachers accountable for student test scores. Right? That's a much different theory of change, as they call it. So I'm actually much more hopeful about that, because I completely agree with you. If we're not able to get to a place where we can actually focus our attention on making schools places that people actually want to be in, our cause is lost.
Well, let me disagree with you slightly, but in this conversation, I worked at a district of under 30,000 kids had different groups of high income and low income. And in the 60s, they won the ACLU Lamplighter Award for being the first urban school district to voluntarily desegregate. The Hilltop area in Tacoma is like 90% poverty, almost all Black. And they set up magnet schools, like you said, Greg, and all the teachers visited people in the summer, and they successfully created this just absolutely wonderful program that desegregated the schools voluntarily. And you know who was pushing that were the white liberals on the north end of Tacoma in the nice houses that were they were the ones that said, you can't be doing, they were the ones showing up at the school board meetings saying, this is wrong. You can't have this discrepancy. So that was then. What do we have now? Cory Booker, the Democratic Party, Bill Gates with his policies, race to the top with Duncan. These are all the kind of the liberal Democrats. And I agree with you that Biden has surprised me, really in a positive way. I don't agree with his mandating testing. But that's another story. But how did the Democrats become part of the problem and complicit in the dismantling that you are expressing in your book? Or do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really true. I think a lot of it gets back to what I was talking about, this, this sense, this generational shift in the Clinton era, that generation of Democrats were really tarred by the Reagan era backlash. And so you see them shifting policies in a whole bunch of areas. Labor would be one of the most profound ones, right? That, like, we're basically, we're going to break with big labor, because that's, employers are now sort of, they're, ones who are setting the course. And I think we can look back at that and think, like, wow, that has not worked out at all. And one of the consequences is that the sorts of policies that you're talking about, the early on, this kind of voluntary desegregation, overall that was not effective. That you end up with the kind of situation that Greg was talking about, where magnet schools, which are proposed as part of a broader, package of desegregation policies, become really attractive to the parents who have the most means. And so as we get more and more unequal, you see the same story playing out in, virtually in all these communities, which is that a magnet school, which is supposed to bridge divides, in fact becomes, dominated by the families who already have the most. And so I think that's why you start to see Democrats losing faith in
Right.
those.
Those would be the nice white parents.
Yeah, the nice white parent, and that this has only gotten more extreme, right?
Right,
That like
right.
that as long as the nice white parents feel like they have to give something up, their voluntary compliance is not going to be the way to solve a structural problem. But I would argue that the sorts of policies that have been put forward by the long list of people that you sort of rattled off there, the Bill Gateses, the Cory Bookers, basically what they do is they take a kind of neoliberal approach where, we have schools compete against each other, parents vote with their feet. They take those sorts of policies and they put them on top of something that's already unequal. And so this is why they've proved to be so disappointing. You look at a system that was held up by a model, and now people are kind of saying, well, maybe not so much, like a Denver, right? So Denver was the brainchild of Michael Bennett, who ran for president in 2020. And the idea was, that schools aren't going to improve on their own, and unless teachers are basically forced to help lift up the population of kids who need the most help, they won't do it. We'll have the situation that Greg's talking about where students are just sort of warehoused. And so Denver goes with what's called a portfolio district. Treat your schools like you would a portfolio of stocks. Weed out the lowest performers. Reward the best performers by letting them expand. And so what happens? It's always the schools in the black neighborhoods that end up getting closed. This then becomes a source of enormous resentment. The fact that, that school quality is measured entirely on the basis of math and English test scores. And so now, Denver is rethinking that approach, spurred largely by backlash. So I think we're in this weird situation. Part of the reason I'm not 100% enthusiastic about the Biden people. Of course, there are a long list of things: foreign policy, the border, but just with regard to economics and education, I think it's very positive that the Biden people seem intent on confronting poverty directly.
Yeah.
But the challenge is that I don't think they know then how to talk about what schools are for. Like, is education still our economic policy? Is what you earn still based on what you learn? Or do schools mean something else? Right now, if you listen to them, they have no idea. They talk about standardized testing. Mostly they're just saying we're going to throw a whole bunch of money at schools, but they don't really have anything else to say. And this is concerning.
Well, that goes to, you recommended the book is it Schoolhouse Burning or School?
Yes, by Derek Black.
I read that. What a wonderful historian. That was just a treat. It reminded me a little bit of The Pioneers by David McCullough, who talked about the expansion of the Ohio, Indiana, Northwest Territories. And in that expansion, they had three things that they said. One, freedom of religion. No, all religions, can get along with each other. No slavery. We're not going to be slave. But the most important thing is public education.
Isn't that amazing?
That from K through college, free public education, because they so remarkably felt that this democracy wouldn't work without a educated workforce. And all of in the book Schoolhouse Burning, he does such a good job of showing how all of these states had paramount duty of education.
I know, it's amazing.
And what happened?
And not just, to me, even like having read his book and knowing some of the history, going back and realizing that, it's not just K-12, but K through college. It's right. It's in the Indiana Constitution. And another book that I would really recommend is Mike Consol's book, Beyond the Market. And Greg, I think you'll really like this one too. And he goes back and revisits key parts of American history and key policy areas, education, healthcare, and various ways that people have tried to come up with alternatives to the market. And like how deeply that resistance is woven through the American story. And part of what so confounds me about our present moment is that you really feel this collective exhaustion with the marketization of everything, that even on the right, like when you hear somebody like a Josh Hawley railing against Walmart, however phony it is, he knows that his constituents do feel like Walmart hollowed out their towns, right? And so, but there's one area where we're going full speed ahead with marketization, and that's K-12 education. That there, the real pressure at the state level, especially in states where Republicans made big gains in 2020, is to remove as much oversight as possible and to provide K-12 education through an unregulated marketplace. And I find these two trends happening in parallel, like really just impossible to reconcile.
Yeah. Your point about poverty, I think, is well taken, and that's the essential thing. And that was the problem with Brown versus Board of Education, that it put the onus on the children rather than dealing with the actual neighborhoods, the actual housing patterns, economic disparities. They didn't have the guts to do that, frankly. And so then it all fell on the back of the kids, and we paid a heavy price. And with Millikin versus Bradley, we foreclosed the ability to, we shut the door on equality because you had to meld the suburbs with the cities to make that work. So what does it mean? It means you have to lay much of the blame in urban areas, in particular in the North, at the hands of the politicians. And they're virtually all Democratic Party politicians. They did nothing, just as they've done nothing about the police. I mean, you think about who controls the police, the mayors of all the big cities, and yet they do nothing to change that situation at all. But back to education, much of, in my view, and I'm not a historian, but in my view, much of the move to a public education, compulsory public education, was driven by immigration and by industrialization in this country. And maybe I'm not right, but if I'm right, and compulsory education in that late 19th century into the 20th century period was largely driven by that and eventually paid for by most of us, never was paid for by the corporate leaders. They should have paid for it as education for their industries, but they didn't pay for it. We did. But if I'm right, we're up against a real problem here because the deindustrialization of the United States since the 70s means that corporately there's no drive, there's no impetus, there's no desire to have a public education system. It doesn't benefit U.S. corporations. It's not just conservatives, not just the Democrats. It's really capitalism that really doesn't benefit from public education. So they've kind of written it off. If it's not STEM, and if you can't get through the situation because you're somehow an elite into college, forget about it.
Yeah.
That you're reminding me of an interview that I did a couple years ago with political economist Gordon Lafer. Do you know him?
I've heard the name.
Yeah, so I know I'm just recommending guest after guest and book after book. But so Gordon wrote a book called The 1% Solution.
Oh,
and he was working on Capitol Hill after the 2010 wave elections. And he started tracking all of the bills that were, like rapidly passing in all these state houses, and he really he really focused on ALEC in the American Legislative Exchange Commission in a substantive way. People throw the name around a lot, and I think it just sort of, they use it to represent corporate conspiracy. But Gordon really dug into what the corporate lobby was actually enacting. And so he has a whole chapter about education. And one of my questions for him was, at a certain point, isn't this self-defeating? Like, what is the logic behind corporations divesting from public education? And his answer was so bleak that I continue to think about it today. And he said basically that they know, the people who really run this country know that we are a nation in decline, that is not going to change. And so their goal is to manage decline without setting off a social explosion, to basically allow things to get worse and worse, right, without people rising up. And education becomes a very powerful means of doing that, because it's the most direct way in which you set people's expectations. And so their goal is to sort of set off a cascade of lowered expectations. And I'll send you a link to the podcast, because it's really good.
Thank you.
And his argument was just basically that they're, like most of those big corporations, they're not even based here anymore. They're the majority of their employees are in other countries, so it's actually not as self-defeating as you might think. So what I took issue with was that may be true for the largest corporations, but it's certainly not true for small businesses. And so you can actually see sometimes in states that have gone the furthest down the school privatization route, like in Arizona, that there is backlash from employers about divesting from public education. Same in Texas, right? The reason Texas does not have private school vouchers is because they have a grocery store billionaire named Charles Butt, who happens to be very loyal to the idea of publicly funded public schools. So I actually think this is going to be really interesting to watch, that you'll see the sorts of splits and fissures within the business community that could turn out to be important. But I agree with you, Greg. Things are not looking good.
Right. Here's an Alex story. Back in 2000, I've got my dates wrong, 14 or so. There was this group of bills going across the country. It was the third grade of
reading retention.
Yes. So as the director of evaluation, we are expected to give a third grade test, and that third grade test would determine if you would automatically retain the child.
Mm-hmm.
And if the child, and you had to have conferences with parents, and then the parents had to sign off that you're not retaining the child.
Mm-hmm.
And when I looked at the bill, it was boilerplate. It was a boilerplate bill. It passed.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant that you normally were giving your spring tests, but the test results wouldn't come back in time to have the results. So you had to give an extra test. And then when you're looking at the number of parents and the number of teachers, you're looking at weeks and weeks of teacher time meeting with parents. It was horrible. And it just kind of went through the subcommittees and passed, and it was a remarkably harmful bill, and then finally got tweaked and changed. But holy cow, that's happening all over with Alec, isn't it?
Yes. So I know you listened to my New Hampshire podcast, and that was actually one of the themes, that it's not just that you see this intense push for school privatization right now. It's the level of policy intrusion, and the third grade reading retention law would be a perfect example. If you look at a state like Florida, what that law does is it puts immense pressure on parents to leave those schools, right? Because they don't want their kids held back. The school has almost no flexibility as far as determining what's right for that individual kid. And so, Florida now has a parallel system of publicly funded private schools. And even calling them private schools, you get this image in your mind of, like a Phillips Exeter. We're talking about like a school in a strip mall. And there's no regulation at all, because the theory behind it is that parents are the best regulators, right? And so just this week, Florida expanded that private school voucher program yet again. Now the income threshold has been raised to $100,000. Right, which, if you know anything about Florida, that's a high income, and so the idea is I really think it's to make in many ways it's to make the public school as unappealing and as rigid as possible, and so the demand for these completely unregulated programs just continues to grow.
Have you ever thought about writing scripts for horror movies? You know,
I
this
do.
is
I do have a lot of different side hustles. I could take that on.
that's
I liked your chapter on teachers unions. I thought it was very, very good.
Oh, thank you. I
Explained
wrote
the,
that one.
well, that says something, doesn't
Uh
it?
huh.
And I think if I want to find I want to be optimistic about the future. I think it's going to come from teachers unions. I was really struck and happy to see West Virginia, Los Angeles, Oklahoma.
Hmm.
These were really grassroots. I mean, the union leadership was not so excited about fighting
Hmm.
because they're going on
Right.
strike, but the workers were, and these workers were educated, and they demonstrated that they had an investment in public education, not just their income, not just their benefits,
Hmm.
not the perks. They wanted public education to be better, and it's. I think the template for that was probably the Chicago Federation of
Hmm.
Teachers, which has really been a great source of leadership in this thing. So I find a lot of optimism in their activities. We just need more of it. We need a lot
Hmm.
more of
So I have good news and bad news on that front. Which do you want first?
it.
you choose.
Well, so you mentioned Oceanville. I always get it mixed up. You mentioned
Brown and Oceanville, something like
yes,
that.
yes. So there's been a split in this country between teachers unions and particularly African American parents, but really parents of color. That there's no conversation about unions that doesn't somehow come back to that sort of bitter battle over local control. One of the really interesting things that's happened during the pandemic is that teachers unions have been the loudest voices for a safe return to school. They're really like the only force that's demanding a more robust response to COVID, period. And so one of the really interesting things you see is that despite the just immense kind of pundit pile-on against teacher unions during the pandemic, um, approval of teacher unions has actually risen during the pandemic among
Oh,
parents of color. And that's because they really see them as allies on this key safety issue. So imagine if we were to come out of this and we could see, some bridging of divides in the past. Now, the bad news is that in a lot of those states that I mentioned where Republicans made big gains in 2020, their very top of their legislative agenda has been payback against those teachers who walked out in 2018. And so in places like West Virginia and Oklahoma and Arizona, they've really been intent on trying to ensure that that never happens again. Um,
what are some examples of the legislation to the payback legislation?
so in West Virginia, they were really explicit. Like striking was already illegal, but they made it super duper illegal. In a lot of those states, the reason that the schools were closed down wasn't just because teachers walked out. It was because school administrators closed the schools, and so they made that now illegal as well. And then just these sweeping expansions of private school choice. So West Virginia actually passed one of the biggest in the country. And so what that will do is that it will just give a portion of state taxpayer education funds. In West Virginia, it's about $5,000. To parents to spend on anything they want. But the idea is to shift funds away from the public schools to private schools and homeschooling. And the really, I mean, it's payback because the public schools are unionized. And so the most direct way they have of weakening the union and its ability to make demands, not just about schools, but about all sorts of things, right? Like the governor's priority in West Virginia is to eliminate the income tax. So if you can shrivel the number of union members, you stand a much better chance of being able to get your radical agenda through. And so it's been really pretty kind of appalling to see just these sweeping proposals just get jammed through, or often there's you see them get enacted over really loud public opposition, or the local press is now so anemic that they barely even are able to convey just how radical this stuff is.
Well, our local press on educational matters, Seattle Times Ed Labs, is a grant funded by Bill Gates.
Right, you're all
And
about solutions journalism.
and Bill Gates is the reason why we have charter schools in our state. I don't know if you know the history, but we started with initiatives and it was 2-1 against.
Right.
And he kept spending money and bringing it up again and bringing it up again. And it finally, after five times, it passed like 51 to 49.9%. And he spent roughly $30 million buying people that would be paid to get signatures for the initiatives. And being a statistician, I did a little research. So Bill Gates, depending on when you Google it, is worth $131 billion. And he spent $30 million. So let's assume that I'm a millionaire just for purposes. How much would that, in a proportion, what would that be me spending? And it would be me spending about $228. So that's nothing. I mean, that's a fancy
Right.
meal for a couple of his friends. That's what passed it. And it's the same thing with Bezos. He's buying a couple of preschool programs that are and this is wonderful. He gets great PR. It comes out to him buying 2 cups of coffee. I can't believe how our democracy has been so distorted by these billionaires. And don't get me going on Gates with Common Core and stack ranking and the measuring effective teachers and videos in the classroom. I mean, he has been, in my opinion, a very destructive force in education. Are you getting any Gates grants? Can you honestly talk about that? Or
I can say I'm not getting any grants from Gates or Bezos.
Okay, all right. So am I correct, or am I just being histrionic?
No, I mean I followed what happened in Washington really closely, and at one point I interviewed Joanne Barkin, who's just a great writer and follower of the money, about how just how relentless they were about going back again and again, and then you can see their theory of change, right? It's not just that you manage to control the democratic process, but you decide in advance, what the metrics of success are, and then you set up a whole ecosystem, all the organizations, all the media outlets, and determining in advance that this experiment is going to be proclaimed a success, which I really don't get the sense in Washington that that's been the case with charter schools. That seems like it seems like they've run into trouble all along the way, correct?
Well, they have, and they limited the number of them, but it's not just the charter schools. It's the research that's being done. I'm a member of the Washington Educational Research Association, and who funds the research? Mm-hmm. It's Gates. All of these professors are sponsored by Gates. And what's the research? It's on how, if you just test the kids and figure out where the bad teachers are, you can purge them, and that'll fix everything. And I know people that I go to Gates' office many times and had meetings there. They're wonderful, bright people, and they all look beautiful, and they're just great. But if you talk to anybody who works in the organization that doesn't agree with the agenda, you're gone. There's no room for somebody to push back against the groupthink of this kind of singular vision of how he sees education. And it's not been a good story. Small schools.
Why would you think it wouldn't be that way? I mean, that's what rich people do. I mean, it's kind of like their MO. It's not they dictate to people what they want. If I'm going to pay your salary, you're going to do what I want you to do. That's the essence of wealth and inequality in this country. And I think for social democrats, in our case, the Democratic Party, to dig out of this hole, it's going to require an address of inequality. It's growing by leaps and bounds. And I know that, in fact, the shrewdness of the strategy to create charter schools. The first charter school in Pittsburgh was given to the Urban League. I was the first speaker in the discussions around the public discussions around the busing in the city. I spoke, and the Urban League was right there, and they led the charge on allowing busing, fighting for school integration. As soon as that was over, they were given a charter for charter schools. They were given the first charter in Western Pennsylvania. So, and of course, when you look at the charter schools in the area, they're really it's shrewd on their part. They're really appealing to Black and poor people. The teachers are Black, the students are Black, because they've got the crappy end of the stick when it comes to education.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been kind of a bummer of a podcast.
I was going to say on that sunny note.
I'm really, it's a little too early to do day drinking, but it's a consideration. But anyway, yeah, that's amazing. Maybe you could just talk about one thing that's not in your book, but was in your recent podcast. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the Free Staters in New Hampshire, and how that is, I guess, the theme of their involvement, this kind of libertarian defund, is being is kind of central to the theme of the wolf that's at your door. Tell me about this. I knew nothing about that, but I was fascinated by it.
So in the early 2000s, a small group of libertarians announced this really ambitious plan that they were going to move to New Hampshire en masse. They were going to recruit 20,000 libertarians, and that the idea was that New Hampshire would become a libertarian utopia. And they picked it for a number of reasons. It's a low population state, but it also has all these sort of unusual, very sort of democratic levers. So they have an enormous House of Representatives, more than 400 members, and all these very hyper local democratic processes. So if you live in a little New Hampshire town, you spend a lot of time voting on things. Like they even vote on teacher union contracts. The town does, right? And so there are all these ways you can get involved. And so this really proved to be a powerful draw. And so because New Hampshire, like all states, spends, the bulk of its state funds on education, even though they fund education poorly in New Hampshire, that quickly became the thing that the libertarians were seeking to defund. And so I got interested in this because I met a school board member, and he was trying to figure out, like, what is with these anti-tax activists in our town. He lives in Sunapee, which is a bucolic town, and they've led this years-long effort to keep the town from building a new and then repairing an elementary school. So I just got really interested in this, and I think, I was somebody who I'd heard about the Free State Project, and I thought it was kind of a joke, and it had been a while since I'd heard anything about it, so I assumed it had been a flop. And so this year, now that New Hampshire has a Republican trifecta in they have the governor and both branches in the state legislature, and you see them pushing these incredibly radical proposals, state voucher, private school vouchers being one of them. But things like they just snuck a bill into the budget that bans teachers from discussing quote unquote divisive concepts. So that means racism or sexism. So much for live free or die. But it really did. It reminded me so much of what we're seeing in other states. How the Trump era really created an opening for all sorts of radical, fringy stuff that's been out there forever. And now, people are so worked up for so many different reasons that if you've got your ideological vision all ready to go, it's a great opportunity for you to just sort of, march ahead. So yeah. I feel like once again, I've brought us down.
Well, keep on that. So that's something. Jennifer, we've been about an hour, and I just can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this.
Likewise.
I have been so enjoying your podcast and shared it with so many people, and I feel like the awkward, nerdy ninth grader that just had a date with the valedictorian prom queen. I just oh my gosh.
Can you imagine?
You know, so it has been,
Like
it
what
has
a
been,
what a high school that would be.
that would be good. That'd be a good high
Eastern
school.
Illinois University.
Yeah.
That's
If
right.
you paid
Eastern
attention when you were at
Illinois
Eastern Illinois
University.
It all,
University, you
it
wouldn't feel
all,
so inadequate.
yeah. So that's good. So anyway, thank you so
I
much.
agree.
Thank
agree.
you.
I
Thank
appreciate
What a
it.
wealth of knowledge.
And we will
Unbelievable.
in the description notes we'll link to your
Oh,
book.
great.
And this is a must book study for a lot of my educators that are still in the trenches, and it stimulates so many discussions that I think are much needed right now. And you know, I think you said in the book that, you know, there's a wolf at the schoolhouse door, and what do you do when you see a wolf? You stand up and act big, and you shout, and you know, make a ruckus. And I think you did a good job making a ruckus. So
Well, thank you so much, and it was such a pleasure to meet both of you. Congrats on your new podcast.
yeah. Well,
Thank you.
I'm writing a letter to Noam Chomsky, so we'll see if that'll work. So we
good.
figured go big or go home. So
Go big or go home. Thanks,
All
you
right.
guys.
Thank you.